It's not yet 6 in the morning on September 17th, 1862, and I'm crouched in a cornfield outside a little Maryland town called Sharpsburg, and I can't see 10 feet in front of me. The fog is that thick, heavy, gray, clinging to everything like it doesn't want to leave. But I can hear what I can't see. Somewhere out past the corn, close enough that it turns my stomach, there are men loading rifles. A cough gets swallowed. Somebody murmurs an order I can't make out. And I realize, crouched there with my hands shaking for reasons that have nothing to do with the morning chill, that within a few minutes, this quiet little field is going to become the bloodiest piece of ground in American history. Something in me already knows it, the way an animal knows a storm is coming before the sky changes. They'll call this place the Cornfield, and by noon, there won't be a single stalk left standing taller than a man's knee. Every inch of it will get cut down by rifle fire, like some enormous scythe swept through in one pass. And underneath the wreckage, more bodies than most of us have seen in our whole lives, Union and Confederate both, thrown into the same ruined acre. I'm a private with the 1st Corps under Major General Joseph Hooker, and this morning we're leading the attack. Hooker's out ahead of us on a white horse, which tells you something about the man. Bold to the point of reckless, the kind of officer who trusts speed and nerve to make up for whatever else is missing. Behind him, safely removed from all this, is our overall commander, George McClellan, a careful, deliberate man who has spent this entire campaign convinced that Robert E. Lee's army outnumbers ours 2 or 3 times over. He's wrong. Lee has something like 38,000 men against our 87,000. McClellan just doesn't know it, and that mistaken caution is going to cost us the chance to end this war today. Because Lee shouldn't even be here, not with a force this small, not with a river at his back that isn't easy to cross if things go badly. 9 days ago, a Union corporal found Lee's own orders wrapped around 3 cigars, dropped carelessly in a field by some Confederate courier. Special Order 191, they called it. Lee's entire plan laid out in black ink, landing in McClellan's hands like a gift nobody deserved. It showed Lee had split his army in 2, sending Stonewall Jackson off to take Harper's Ferry, while the rest sat here near Sharpsburg, spread thin and exposed. McClellan had a chance to crush Lee's forces piece by piece before they could reunite. Instead, he sat on the information for 18 hours, and Lee's men used the delay to force march through the night and close the gap. That's the whole reason I'm standing in this field right now instead of watching a broken Confederate army retreat. The order finally comes down the line, forward, and we step into the corn, and the fog just swallows us whole. For a second, there's nothing but the sound of stalks brushing against wool trousers and the taste of fear sitting at the back of my throat. Then it isn't quiet anymore. The first volley comes out of the corn from somewhere I can't see, maybe 40 yards off. Stonewall Jackson's men. And by now, that name alone carries a kind of dread up and down both armies. Thomas Jonathan Jackson, the general who stood firm at Bull Run and earned that nickname, who marched his troops through the Shenandoah Valley so hard and so fast that Union commanders swore he had twice the men he actually did.
Form the line,
his soldiers
hold
don't
steady.
break. They never have. So they hold now, even as our line fires back and the corn between us just disappears into smoke and screaming.
I fire my rifle. I couldn't tell you if I hit anything. Honestly, I can't tell you much of anything from those first minutes, except that the man next to me, a kid from Ohio who told me an hour earlier about a girl waiting for him back home, goes down and doesn't get back up. And I have to step over him to keep the line moving, and somehow I do it, because my body seems to know what to do even when the rest of me has stopped thinking. There's a smell I wasn't ready for. Gunpowder, obviously, that's everywhere, thick enough to taste. But underneath it, there's something warmer and worse, and it takes me a while to understand it's blood and torn up earth and the sweetish rot of corn stalks shredded apart before their time. Officers on horseback are riding up and down what's left of the line, shouting orders that get lost almost as soon as they leave their mouths, because nobody can hear anything over the guns except the guns themselves.
I see a man from my own company kneel down to check on someone, and then just stay kneeling there, not moving. And I don't have time to find out why before the line surges forward again and carries me with it. The cornfield changes hands something like 15 times that morning. 15 times, blue and gray crashing back into each other over the same torn-up acre, until eventually artillery on both sides just starts firing straight into the corn itself, past caring who's standing where. By 8 o'clock, more than 8,000 men are dead or wounded, and the fog still hasn't fully burned off.
By midday, the fighting has shifted south, to an old farm lane worn down below the level of the surrounding fields by decades of wagon traffic. It's a natural trench, and Confederate troops under D.H. Hill have turned it into one, using the sunken ground the same way a man might use a wall. For 3 hours, Union assaults break against that lane again and again, like waves against a seawall, whole regiments walking up and over the edge of the field, only to be cut down before they reach it. Word passes back that when the Confederate line there finally gives way, it isn't because the position was weak. It's because so many of the men holding it are already dead that there's simply nobody left standing to fire. The dead pile up so thick down there that men who see it afterward can't shake the image for the rest of their lives. Nobody calls it the Sunken Road after today. It becomes Bloody Lane, and the name sticks for good. To the south, Ambrose Burnside, the general whose distinctive whiskers will eventually give us the word sideburns, spends most of the afternoon trying to force his way across a narrow stone bridge over Antietam Creek, defended by maybe 400 Georgia riflemen firing down from the bluff above. The creek itself is barely knee-deep in most places. His men could have waded across almost anywhere along its length. But Burnside fixates on that bridge, and hundreds of his soldiers die trying to cross 40 feet of stone while bullets rain down on them from above. By the time he finally takes it, he's burned hours Lee's army desperately needed him to burn. And that's exactly what saves Lee. Just as Burnside's men push forward late in the day, close to cutting off the Confederate line of retreat entirely, a division under A.P. Hill comes tearing onto the field. His men had marched 17 miles from Harper's Ferry in under 8 hours to get there. Hill's troops slam into Burnside's flank and stop the advance cold as the sun starts going down. By nightfall, the guns finally fall silent. 23,000 men are dead, wounded, or missing. More American casualties in a single day than on any other day before or since. Lee's battered army slips back across the Potomac the next night, and McClellan, cautious right to the end, lets him go without pursuit. A decision that costs him his command within 2 months. But something else comes out of Antietam. Even though the battle itself was, by most honest military accounts, closer to a draw than a victory, Lee's invasion of the North had been turned back. And that's enough for Abraham Lincoln, who's been waiting for exactly this kind of opening. 5 days later, he uses it to announce the Emancipation Proclamation, turning a war fought over union into a war fought over freedom, and making it a lot harder for Britain or France to justify backing a nation fighting to preserve slavery. I don't know any of that yet, sitting in the dark that night in a cornfield that isn't really a cornfield anymore, surrounded by wounded men and dying men, and a silence that feels louder than the fighting did. Somewhere out past the tree line, stretcher bearers are still working by lantern light, and every so often a voice calls out for water, or for a mother, or for nothing in particular. Nobody sleeps, not really. All I know is that I'm still alive. I don't understand why, and tomorrow the sun is going to come up over a field full of the dead, and somehow, impossibly, this war is going to keep going.